So, with draft fantasy draft season is upon us, and today we have a very tall task. We are going to show you that even if you're not drafting number one in your fantasy leagues, you can still win your league, and we'll walk you through how to do that. So, if you are interested in fantasy baseball and winning, you should subscribe to this channel because we show you how we use data and math to beat other fantasy teams and take advantage of some of the inefficiencies and some of the projection systems that are out there. And today we have a very tall task. We are actually going to show you how we are going to draft against another team who picks number one. And we're not just talking about in the snake draft. We're going to let them take the first pick in every round that they want based on average draft position and show you the math behind how we're still going to beat them. And if you watch some of my other videos or you subscribe to this channel, you know it's based on my player value ranking system, which uses the data in this case from my league based on who will get drafted on the top 150 hitters and the average data that they've produced. And then we take every player and we do a ratio versus the expected runs, home runs, RBIs, all the categories for an average hitter or a player who would get drafted. And then we assign the value for that by summing them up. So you can see here, the challenge is what you expect is based on average draft position or a projection system of your own, you would expect to see just the value of the players decline all the way through the draft. So you'd say it's going to be really hard or impossible to catch up with someone who drafts number one. But what really happens when you look at the numbers and actually do this type of player value, you see there's some huge inefficiencies that occur. And so therefore you want to stay on the high end of this curve, and that's how you win your fantasy leagues versus draft on the low end of this curve where you will lose your fantasy leagues. And I'll show you how this can occur as we go through it. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to let someone else draft number one every single round, and they're likely to draft based on average draft position. And we're going to use actually math and data to draft after them and still beat them. So here's what we're going to do. It's going to be one round at a time. And this is for illustrative examples. We're only doing hitters. We're only doing 11 rounds. So don't put in the comments coming after me if the positions aren't perfectly balanced, or in some cases, these are based on some projections and numbers from a week ago. So we'll just see how that works. So in the first round, if someone drafts number one overall, they're going to draft based on average draft position, and they're going to take Shohei Ohtani. And that's actually going to make this a really tough task to give someone the first pick in every round and know that they're going to have Shohei and then try to chase them down and still beat them is actually a pretty big task, but we're going to try to do it. So that's the reason is when you look at the average value of Shohei Ohtani, he's almost worth two average players because he's 64% more runs than the average player, more than twice as many home runs as the average player, 40% more RBIs than the average player, and 2.5 times as many steals as the average player, and he's above average in batting average and on base percentage. So depending on which type of league you play in, he's absolutely fantastic across the board. And I think what you're going to see here is certainly at the top of the draft, there's not as much inefficiency because the best players are the best players. However, when you get later in the draft, you're going to see there's a really tough decisions people need to make on who is really the next best player and really which categories do you need so that you don't overdraft a single category to win. And that's what we're going to do. So we let them draft Shohei in the first round, and on average, we're going to draft somewhere in the middle of the round. There's some examples where I deviate from that, but don't look at that. We're just going to show you the average data that we need in order to compete and try to beat them. So in this case, if we draft fifth, the average draft position here, we'll take Jose Ramirez. Now you can take Aaron Judge or something like that if you draft two, but if we're drafting the middle of the round, we're going to take Jose Ramirez, who based on the projection system here it's a kind of a summary of a couple projections. He's ranked number 2 overall, but this is a tall task. In the bottom here, I kind of have a standing table to show you the gap between the total points drafted and what's the gap between them for runs and home runs in each category. And you can see we take a huge hit in the beginning because Shohei Ohtani is projected to be, even in my value system, far and away the best player in baseball next year. And so really we take a big hit, almost a 1 total point gap in average on base percentage leagues. And a lot of it's driven by home runs, and stuff like that. The only place we have a slight advantage is that Jose Ramirez steals a little more bases. So when you see categories in green, that is where we have an advantage because there's no gap. And when we see a red number, that's where we have a gap. So if we're playing head to head after one round, yes, we would certainly lose almost everything other than stolen bases if we're just doing Jose Ramirez against Shohei Ohtani. But that's what we're going to see as you can keep going to see if we can close this gap. So now in the second round, I'm excluding pitchers, so then there's nobody, average draft position of 11. So it is 13, which is Fernando Tati, and you can see he's pretty good. He's above average almost everything other than RBIs, so that's a very good, well-balanced pick for someone here. That's why he's ranked so high in average draft position recommendations. However, he's actually only the 16th recommendation. You can see here we're going to drop off pretty quickly, and we're going to get closer to the average player sooner than you may expect, but we're always going to try to stay drafting above average players and let someone else take average or below average players. Now, in this case, don't put in the comments on me. We're going to take Francisco Lindor. This is based on, the projections and rankings as of a week ago or so. So I did a whole video on his hamate bone injury and how to adjust for that in the projections. But let's just take this as the data. This is not specific to Lindor, but this is illustrative to the types of stats that you can draft and when they might be available in your leagues. And that's going to vary based on your drafts, your rankings, and your projections. This is for illustrative examples. But you can see here, he's actually ranked 8th overall. So we actually gain a little bit here. So we close the gap a little bit overall. We're down a point. Now we're only down 0.2 and 0.3 of a point overall. And now we've actually have slight advantages, not just in stolen bases, but a little bit in RBIs, and we still have a pretty big gap in home runs. So this is kind of an area we need to start to track down as we keep going and see how we do this, right? So now if we go to the third round, drafting, based on this, they're going to take the 21 overall, which is Jackson Chourio, and he has pretty good above 6.14 average ranking here, and really he's actually above average everything other than on base percentage. So it's not a very that's a good, pretty decent pick, and obviously a pretty trendy pick. But if you've seen some of my videos, I talk about some of the warnings for Jackson Chourio where he might be overestimated for other players, and this is kind of where we make our first splash. So we will never draft anyone with an average draft position ahead of the other team, because if they draft first, we assume everybody in that player pool, above them is gone. So therefore, we're going to take, in this case, Kyle Schwarber. You've seen some of my videos. I talk about, I think he is criminally undervalued in these leagues. You can see here on paper, it looks like pretty about the same, 6.2 versus 6.14. Not a huge difference, but he really helps us where we need it, which is this twice as many home runs as the average player. And that helps us kind of close that home run gap a little bit between our competition here. And he really, you give up a low stolen bases and a little bit in batting average, but overall he contributes in some of the categories that we desperately need. So now here we look at the summary table and the standings for round 3. We're actually getting pretty close to parity here on average and on-base percentage league totals. However, we're getting pretty close in runs. We now have an advantage in home runs and RBIs. We've kind of given back our advantage in stolen bases because Chourio certainly steals a lot more bases than Kyle Schwarber, and things are still pretty close in batting average and on-base percentage, right? So now we go to round 4, and we can see here is they would draft, obviously, whoever's the 31st in average draft position, and they would feel like they're on top of it. Now they get the number one, one of the top second baseman, Ketel Marte, and he's 0.44. You can see here he doesn't contribute a whole lot in stolen bases, but he's near average or slightly above average, helps you in the home runs, stuff like that. But you can see we're only in the 4th round, and we're getting dangerously close to most players being near an average player of 5.0 kind of points. That's why Shohei has so much value, because he's so much better than even the guys you can get in the 4th round, right? However, we're going to take, shockingly, look at this. We're going to take not someone in the 30s in average draft position. We're going to drop way down to Mookie Betts in the 48th average draft position. But in my rankings, he's 30th based on pure numbers and the categories he can contribute for your team. And so we get a slight advantage over Ketel Marte, and we gain a little bit here. So now you can see, for total points in an average league, we're getting pretty close. On base percentage, we have a slight advantage. Home runs and runs, they still have a lead, but it's getting a little closer. We're actually now have some advantages in RBIs. And then we are close, but a little bit behind stolen bases average and on base percentage. So after 4 rounds of drafting, we have some advantages, but we've covered some ground, and we've gotten pretty close. However, no doubt whoever's drafted 4 rounds, number 1 overall, will have some advantages, but we're in the game right now. So now let's take a look at round 5. So round 5, you would take, based on the pitchers and so forth, you would take Bryce Harper as the 44th average draft position and see what he does for those categories. And then we would actually drop way down into the 60s to grab Freddie Freeman, who we still cede a little bit of ground because Bryce Harper is a pretty decent choice for a 5th round pick. But Freddie Freeman, he gets 5.32 average points. He doesn't hurt you in anything. He's a little below average in stolen bases. But I really wanted, when looking at this, I really wanted this above average and on base percentage to make sure that we, keep beefing those up and give us some opportunities, because obviously Kyle Schwarber would hurt us a little bit in batting average. But you can see here now in the round 5 standings, things are still pretty close. The only 2 categories we're leading right now is a little bit on base percentage and a little bit of RBIs, but we're kind of in the game on the others, but still down because they're picking first every round. Now we go to the 6th round. They're going to take Brent Rooker. He's average draft position would be 51st. So that's the clear choice if you're just drafting based on average draft position. Again, here, he doesn't help you in steals, but above average overall. So this is a pretty solid pick for them. And we're taking 64th overall. We're going to take Josh Naylor. And Josh Naylor is the 24th overall rank. And here we're getting some pretty big points here, 5.9 points, because he really helps you out pretty big in RBIs. He actually gives you decent. He's projected to give you decent above average stolen bases, and he doesn't hurt you in batting average and on base percentage, and he's close enough to average in runs. So now we're starting to, when you look at the standings, we're starting to get a little bit of gap in your total points between average and on base percentage. And that's how you know, as I showed you in the beginning, we're drafting on the high side of the curve, and they just don't know. So they may be drafting the middle, the low side of the curve, and that's how we're going to gain our advantages. And you're going to see as the draft goes on, there's more inefficiencies. You can see the spread was bigger in those curves. There's more opportunities for us to make headway. But we do have this big problem, which is the one that consistently comes up, is we are losing in home runs. And it is hard because obviously people know home runs, people get ranked for home runs, and people draft a lot of home runs. So that's going to be a tricky one for us to chase down. But now we have some advantages in RBIs and stolen bases, and we're still in the game, but behind in some other categories. Now we go to the 7th round. And this is where they start to make some big mistakes here. You can see based on the pitchers in the 7th round, the first average draft position would now be Hunter Goodman of Colorado. But based on our rankings, based on the projections, he would only be the 119th. This is like the first big mistake that they've made. We've had some advantages. We've taken some inefficiencies, but this is one that would be a big mistake. Below average in runs, below average in stolen bases, below average in average, below average in on base percentage, but is obviously a trendy pick because of Colorado and because of the great year that he had. But the projections for next year just don't necessarily back that up for where he's getting drafted in average draft positions. Whereas we take Jarren Duran, where his average draft position is 70th, but he would be 26th overall, and you can see he contributes 5.78 points. He's really helps us out in stolen bases, above average and on base percentage. Yeah, we're still struggling with home runs. We're going to have to address that at some point, but we're gaining overall. Now, you may ask, and if you notice here and say, well, why would you wait a few rounds? If you guys really believe Josh Naylor and Jarren Duran are in your top 25 of our rank, why would we take Mookie Betts and Freddie Freeman, relatively earlier? Shouldn't we draft the higher ranked guys? And you certainly could. But the reason why I did this is because I knew, obviously based on if you know the average draft position, I knew these guys would still be there, and I knew that Betts and Freeman would not. So if we draft Naylor and Duran, Betts and Freeman would not be there, and there's some specific category, especially this high on base percentage and batting average, that we want. So certainly that's a choice you can make and see if you can balance that out, but this is the choice that we made. Now, if you look, we're starting to make some significant headway here because we are basically starting to pull ahead in almost everything other than home runs, but we're still about a whole point behind in home runs. But for all these reasons, where we're in the 7th round and they're accidentally starting to draft below average players, and not only are we still finding above average players, we're finding players who are their actual projections and the categories they contribute would be top 25 projected players versus their average draft position. So we're getting the big gap between where people are getting drafted and the stats they can provide you in this league. Now, in the 8th round, they would go to 71 overall, and they would take Austin Riley. On paper, that sounds pretty good, but he is, again, slightly below average in his projections because he hurts you. He doesn't really contribute in stolen bases. Slightly below average on base percentage, but above average and everything else. So it's an obvious choice you could see some people making an 8th round pick. But our 8th round, we're actually going to take Byron Buxton. You can see a pretty big gap. He's still above average, 5.24. And he really doesn't hurt us in too much. He's a little bit, hurts us a little bit in average and on base percentage and RBIs, but he's above average in home runs, which is an area that we certainly need to address. And you can same thing here. We were starting to pull away in a lot of other categories, and except for home runs. We can see here we're certainly really pulling away in stolen bases, almost 3 points. That might, you could certainly say maybe we're overdrafting stolen bases at this point, and we should have been focusing more on home runs. So this is kind of a situation where I probably would have looked at this in a little more detail and maybe see if I can rebalance it a little bit better than I did. But then maybe that would mean redoing the Jarren Duran pick for a little bit of home runs, someone a little more balanced than that. But let's see if we can. That's going to happen in the drafts, and even if you're tracking how you're doing. But let's see if we can fix it as we go forward. So in the 9th round, based on pitchers, they would take Vinny Pasquantino, who is, again, now a below average player because he's below average in runs, doesn't contribute in stolen bases, and he's pretty close to slightly behind an average in on-base percentage, and he's really only giving you really a significant amount of RBIs is what he's producing. In our case, we'll drop way down to the 99th average draft position, and we take George Springer, who people were probably fading a little bit, but based on the projections, and the projections take into account probably some regression versus the amazing year that he had last year, where he was probably, I think he was a top 20 player overall, maybe even close to the top 15 or top 10. I'll have to go back and look at that. That was in my previous video. But when we look at this, we are in the draft. They have drafted below average players 3 rounds in a row, and they didn't even know it because they're just going by the next best player in the average draft position, and we're looking for nuances and nibbling, and we're finding players still above average contributing across most of the categories in a fairly balanced way. In this case, we've seeded a little bit in RBIs because we talked about Vinny P gives a 1.2 in RBIs, and we're drafting just a hair below in RBIs. We've been bleeding RBIs the last 3 rounds versus average, so we're going to have to address that as well going forward. And now in round 10, and in the pick, that average draft position 91, they would take O'Neal Cruz, who is actually a really pretty solid pick, but it's mostly weighted on his stolen bases. So they're starting to make a little indent to us on stolen bases, but he is below average in everything else. So this is almost like a mirage where it looks good on paper if you think he gets good stolen bases, but you're actually hurting everything else. And he looks average overall, but he's only been getting boosted because of his stolen bases, but he's hurting you in every other category. Whereas we would look at Eugenio Suarez out of Cincinnati, with still an average player, 5.05, but he gives us some of the things we need, which is we need some above average home runs, we need some above average RBIs. So now we're not just starting to look at exactly who the best player available is in total aggregate, but we're starting to draft for the categories that we need. And this is one situation where like, well, he could really hurt us in average and on base percentage. Yes, that is true, but we've overdrafted that all along the way. So that's kind of one of the basis of this. If you're drafting total points, you're banking some stats so that you can use for opportunities later to take some unbalanced guys for the categories you need. In this case, we definitely need home runs and RBIs, and actually we flipped it. Now we're ahead in RBIs and we're getting close in home runs, but we haven't sealed the deal yet. So now we go to the 11th round, and you can see they would take Trevor Story at 101. It was actually pretty decent overall, but the same kind of trap they're kind of falling into, where he looks above average on paper, but he's only really contributing in stolen bases, and he's below average in everything else, and that's going to hurt them as we want to try to catch up. Meanwhile, we draft Michael Busch, and you've seen some of my other videos. You'll see I'm really high on Michael Busch and what he did, and the fact that he had such a great year last year. Hopefully he has another one this year. But I want to point this out. You're saying, hold on, we are actually drafting someone who is below average. Shouldn't we be drafting above average players? And that is true. The other team had 3 rounds in a row fairly early in the 7th where they're drafting below average players. But we are now choosing to draft someone. There were probably players available who had a total higher score, but we're now drafting for the categories we need. He was the kind of the last surge of power available, 1.23 here this late in the draft, and based on them drafting Trevor Story, we were able to close the gap in home runs, and he doesn't hurt us in other things. We banked enough stolen bases that we can take the hit of 2 rounds in a row. They're taking O'Neal Cruz at 2x stolen bases, Trevor Story close to 2x stolen bases. We were not drafting stolen bases at all because we had banked so many steals earlier in the draft, then we now can sacrifice those to trade for the categories we do need, which is home runs and RBIs. And we can even take a hit and average it on base percentage because we're overdrafting that, especially with Freddie Freeman here as well too, right? So now after 11 rounds of drafting hitters only for illustrative purposes, so don't come after me in the comments on some nitty, tic-tacky details and stuff like that. But you can see we have now, after 11 rounds, we've drafted almost 3 points higher in both batting average and on-base percentage. That's getting close to an average player ahead of them, and we've now won every single category while letting someone draft number one in every single round. If it was a snake draft, we would totally crush them, but it's not a snake draft. We let them take the number one pick. They probably think they coming out of this, they had an immaculate draft because everybody with the high average draft position that they wanted was there for them if they were, studying their script and who might be there for them in every single round. Meanwhile, we outdrafted them. That's why I think those really impressive is this kind of summary table here at the end. Whereas if you look here, on the average draft position, they think they drafted really well, whereas on average, we're drafting almost a round behind them. We're taking players, they're thinking we're reaching almost, every single round. They're like, you guys are reaching. You're drafting someone in the 7th round who I have in the 8th round and so forth. But if you look here on the average rank across 11 rounds, we're getting people almost 20 points higher. So we were average draft position about 100 places behind them, but our rank was we were drafting people almost 200 positions ahead of them. And that's why you can see here, at the end of this draft, even though they drafted number one every single round, we beat them in runs, pretty close in home runs, but we did get over the cross the line, beat them in RBIs, beat them in stolen bases, batting average a little close, but we beat them. And on-base percentage pretty good. I've been in enough on-base percentage leagues to tell you this gap of almost, 0.008 is pretty good. If you're in September and you're that much ahead, you have a pretty good chance of that not collapsing. So overall, you can see here how we can use data even on the projections to show you their inefficiencies versus the average draft position rankings and the actual categories, especially the categories you can bank for above average players. And that's how you'd use this script to, one, win your league, find the inefficient players, and also balance your team to make sure you don't overdraft in stolen bases and punt another league, which is totally death. If you're in a rotisserie league, if you're in head-to-head, you might be unbalanced and still win. If you're in a rotisserie league, you can't punt any single category. You must compete in every one of them, so you must track exactly how you're doing. So if you love this type of stuff, subscribe so I'll help you win all year round, and then make sure you watch this other video because I think you might watch this one next.